service. So it is not as simple as we think. People think, oh, it's just about asking a question, right? Sometimes you have to ask the right question in order to get the correct answer. So I wanted to just quickly demonstrate that before we get started. So what I'm going to do is I'll just quickly pull through my Azure OpenAI service that I created as part of our module 1 session. So what we are going to look at is like how you can leverage that, and we can see why prompt engineering is really important. So I'll go to my Azure OpenAI Studio here. So if you remember, like we provisioned a few models like the GPT-4 model, GPT 3.5 model, and so on. We are going to look at like, okay, how can we just leverage that? So let me quickly check whether this is my current deployment. That's right. So I'll go to my chat completion API here. Let me zoom this a bit so you can see it clearly. Great. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to just use an empty example. And one of the thing I'm trying to go and do here is I'm going to ask a question to write a program to create a user in Azure Active Directory. So pretty straightforward. I want the large language model to write a program for me to create a user in Azure Active Directory. So I'll just go ahead and ask this question and we'll see what is the response that we are getting. So if you look at it, of course, I'm getting some response in here. And basically a sample program using the Azure AD Graph API and PowerShell. Now I'm realizing I wanted the code to be written in C#, not in PowerShell. What is the mistake I have done here? If you notice it here, I just asked the large language model to write a program for me to create a user in Azure Active Directory, right? But I didn't specifically tell that to exactly which programming language to use. And now if I go ahead and tailor my prompt to say, write a program in C# to create a user in Azure Active Directory. And if I resubmit this prompt, so we will see what the large language model is going to come back with. Now, if you look at it, it understood I was asking for a C# program, and now I am getting the code written in C#. And this is what exactly when I talk about writing good prompts mean, because the model cannot understand what you are thinking, right? You have to somehow convey what you are thinking by writing good prompts. So here, as I mentioned, like because I didn't specify the programming language that I wanted the model to use, it picked up a programming language that it thought commonly people use PowerShell, right? But if I specifically asked for write a program in C# or write a program using PHP or Python, it is going to write that in that particular programming language. So you have to set the context for what you are expecting from the model really clearly. And that's what prompt engineering is all about. So how can you make sure that you write good prompts, and what are the techniques that you can apply to write good prompts so that the model can provide you the responses exactly what you are anticipating from it. Okay, so with that note, let us get started about what is prompt engineering. When we looked at the Azure OpenAI service, there is a variety of models that we saw there. And as I said, the model availability will vary based on different regions. So if we talk about the different aspects in here, where GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 models, they are prompt based. So you ask a question and you get the responses. And so that's what we saw even from the chat completion API interface. So you ask a question in the type of what we call it as a prompt and you get a response back. So we saw this demonstration, right? In terms of I asked for a write a program to create a user in Azure Active Directory, and it gave me a response without any issues. So the first and foremost where I will get started is around the basic concepts and what are the key elements when it comes to prompt engineering. So we looked at why prompt engineering is really important, but we need to look at like what are the key basics that you need to learn when it comes to prompt engineering. So when we take all these models like GPT-3, GPT 3.5, GPT-4 models from Azure OpenAI, they are all prompt based. So you ask a question in by entering a text prompt, and for which the large language model is going to respond with a text completion. So prompt construction can be difficult. Okay, so it's not as easy as it is, but sometimes in some scenarios, if you want to convey exactly what you are expecting, it can be difficult. But it is more than a art than a science. So what it really means is, if you want to craft a successful prompt, you have to put that into practice. And that's what you are going to learn as part of today's session, is around how can you understand the key general concepts of writing good prompts. So let us get started with the key prompt components. So these are the different prompt components that you can use in order to write good prompts: the instructions, the primary content, examples, cue, and supporting content. So we are going to look at each one of them, and we will see like how you can leverage that. So when I want to talk about prompt basics, basics are nothing but the prompts are how you are interacting with the GPT model. So that is what the prompt is all about. So now you can ask a question, as I said, and that's what we call it as a prompt. And then you will be getting a response. And sometimes like you will be developing more complex prompts, but you have to understand the fundamental part, which is we have to ask what we really are expecting from the model. And that is the key part here. And how you correctly craft your prompt to ask that question is what we call it as the prompt engineering part. There are two types of APIs: completion API and chat completion API. So the GPT-4 models, which is the latest model that Microsoft is recommending everyone to use, is using the chat completion API. With chat completion API, you have to provide a system message, which is basically setting the context for your chat. And then you will be providing examples. Each example will contain what is the question the user is asking and what is the response the assistant or the large language model will be providing. And of course, you can have one to many examples or zero to many examples basically. The first thing that we are going to look at from the prompt component perspective is instructions. So instructions are likely the most commonly used prompt component, because basically like you are giving the instruction to the model on what to exactly do. So they may sound simple in concept, but they can be complex when you put that into practice. We'll learn this through examples, right? Because I love to teach these things through demos so that you can understand it pretty easier. So let us get back to our playground here. So I'll clear the chat. Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just use an example here. I'm going to ask it to write an introduction for a weekly newsletter. So this is basically an instruction. This is what we call it as a simple instruction. A simple instruction is write an introduction for a weekly newsletter. So now this is going to go and ask the large language model, and it is preparing response in terms of writing a simple introduction to a weekly newsletter. So here you can see, welcome to the latest edition. We are delighted to bring you the most recent updates, insights, and happenings from our community. We want to keep you informed and connected. Thank you for being a part of the community. So it is good. So this is what we call it as a simple instruction. So the simple instruction is concise and clear, like write an introduction for a weekly newsletter. I can turn this into a complex instruction. So what I can basically do is I can tweak the prompt in such a way. I can ask a bit more interesting question from that. So what I'm going to do is turn this prompt into a little bit complex prompt. So I'm going to write a bit of a complex prompt. Write an introduction for a weekly newsletter to my company named Contoso. It should mention the great all hands meeting we had last week and thank the team for all their hard work over the tough past few months. So if you look at it, this is basically what we call it as a complex instruction. And if you run this, so what you will get to see is now you can see the way how the newsletter is changing. So previously we didn't mention the company name. So it just gave information about, okay, this is a quick introduction of a newsletter that you can give. But now I mentioned about the company name and exactly told about what we have done as part of the achievements, and want to just thank the team for all their hard work in the last few tough months. So this is an example for how you write a bit of a complex instruction. I can turn that a bit more interesting complex instruction also. So this is another set of instruction where I'm saying same weekly newsletter, an introduction that needs to be written. The company name has been provided. I want a greeting to be provided, thanking the team for their hard work and also the positive outlook for the coming quarter. And key point, these are what we call it as key points. I want that to be incorporated in the newsletter. So now if you send this, to the large language model, it is going to read this prompt and it is going to tailor the response a bit more based on what we have provided. So if you notice here previously it was there is no signature or anything saying who actually wrote the newsletter, and but now you can see it is actually signed off by the senior leadership team because we specifically asked for that. And this is what exactly what you can do with instructions. The more detail you incorporate in your instruction, the model will understand exactly what you are expecting it to deliver. And this is what we call it as instructions. Instructions is the most commonly used prompt component. Basically, this is the question that you are asking the large language model, and it is going to provide you a response. So hope you understood what an instruction is, and you can write instructions that are simple instructions, or you can write instructions that are complex in nature by providing large amount of details. So we saw a good example around this. The next prompt component which I'm going to talk about is what we call it as primary content. So what is primary content is all about? So let me again explain this concept through an example. So getting back here, so primary content is nothing but a set of text that needs to be processed or transformed by the model. Normally, you use a primary text in conjunction with your instructions. So let me give you an example, right? So I'm going to just say give a text, and basically I'm going to just to provide a text that needs to be translated to French. So the text that needs to be translated to French is the first what we call it as the primary content. So let me get some text, and we can see how we can convert that into French. So I'm going to put this text, and then I'm going to say translate to French, and then send it to the prompt. So here, if you are looking at basically what we are asking for is the primary content here is the content that needs to be processed or transformed. What is the content that needs to be translated to French, which is, can you please tell me how to get to the museum? So that is the text that needs to be translated to French. Translate to French is actually the instruction. So you provided the primary content and you have instructed the large language model to translate that particular primary content to French. And that's what the instruction. So as you can see here, the content that you are actually asking the large language model to do something with is what we call it as the primary content. So you can write a lot of things. For instance, like you can give a paragraph and you can just say to it, summarize this particular paragraph. That paragraph of content that needs to be summarized is what we call it as the primary content. So normally primary content is something that you will be using in conjunction with your instructions. So these are some examples. So as you can see, like if you give a paragraph and then you say summarize that particular paragraph for you. So that's what you will be using for the large language model as the primary content. And there is a lot of things that you can do. So basically, like you can write a whole heap of paragraph of content and ask that to summarize a few things in bullet points. And the model will be able to do that clearly. So that's what we call it as the supporting like information that you pass as part of the instruction is what we call it as the primary content. So whether you want to summarize something, you want to convert something, keep in mind you pass that information, which is a primary content in conjunction with the instructions. So these are some examples where you can say like you give a whole paragraph of content and you can ask it to summarize it, and this is what you get. So this content which you're asking it to summarize, that is what we call it as the primary content. The next prompt component we are going to look at is examples. So when you are writing prompts, if you give examples, then it is the model will understand exactly what you are looking for. And sometimes you don't need to write examples like write a job description and stuff. For that, you don't need examples. But there are some things where if you give a headline and if you give it that needs to be categorized to a topic, then probably it is nice to give some examples. So successful prompts, they always rely on the practice of either one shot, which is basically one example, or a few shot, which is a few examples. So that's why it is always recommended for some scenarios where you are looking for a specific way the model needs to respond. add like either a one shot or a few short examples. And sometimes there are prompts where there is no need for examples, like the ones which I told, right? Write a newsletter or write a job description or write a program. For those things, like you don't need to give examples. So that is also okay. So let us look at again some examples around how do we handle either the zero shot or the few shot or a one shot ones. So let me go back here. So what I'm going to do here is like I'm going to try with a zero shot example. So I'm going to provide a headline, and the headline is nothing but the coach confident injury won't derail Warriors. So this is basically a note. And what I'm going to do is I'm asking, okay, categorize this headline to a particular topic. So here I didn't give any example. And then if I'm going to pass this to my large language model, it is said like, okay, it is sports and basketball because I think it is learning a bit normally and it is able to answer it. But if you want to make it a bit more proper in terms of how do we get that to categorize things in a better way, I can give some examples. So for instance, like I will go and change the prompt in such a way. I'll give a headline. I'll give a topic to say this particular headline relates to the topic baseball. This particular headline relates to the topic soccer. This particular headline relates to the topic football. And then I'm asking, okay, what about this headline? Because this is all what we call it as a few short examples. Now, if I ask the question, now it can basically say like it is basketball. So here at least it said sports basketball, but here I want to just to get that basketball straight away because in my examples I clearly said what is the sport, and rather than saying the format in how I want is directly give me the sport category. And this is what the examples can do. So it can tailor your response based on exactly what you are looking for. And that's what it is always recommended, saying if you keep on complaining about the model is not responding in the format I'm looking for, you have to tell the model what is the format that you are expecting the output to be looked like. So in that scenarios, provide few short examples so the model knows exactly what you are looking for. So keep that in mind. And that's why examples are really powerful. And you can use, as I said, zero shot or few short examples. The few more examples you use, the more accurate the model understands what you are expecting from it. The next prompt component we are going to look at is queues. So queues, they act as a jump start for the output of the model. So basically you can help the model to direct to get a desired output. If we can build some queues, and normally we always use that with instructions, but it's not mandatory that you have to use. So for instance, like we will look at some examples where we will use a queue. So let me go back to my chat interface that we have been playing with. So here I'll just jump on to the completions playground just to show there is an example that we have got. So here I'm going to load a simple example so that I can see like how the queue stuff is there. So there is an email example in here. So these are some out of the box examples that you can play with. So here I have got an instruction which says write a product launch email for a new AI powered headphones that are priced at $79.99 and available at Best Buy, Target and Amazon.com. The target audience is tech savvy music lovers, and the tone is friendly and exciting. So this is basically the instruction. So some of the cues that I'm giving is like what should be the subject line of the email and what should be the body of the email. So I could have just said like write a product launch email. I'll leave the instructions with that itself. But why I'm specifically asking this is what we call it as the cue. So the cues are basically telling the model to say, these are the two important things I'm expecting in the output. Make sure that you provide that to me. So here I'm not just asking you to write an email because that's what the instruction says, but I'm specifically asking, give me what is the subject line and give me what is the body of the email. So let us go ahead and generate this, right? And see what is the response that we are getting. So here, because I have particularly asked for two key things, the subject and what is the body of the email, now I got answer in that format. And this is what a queue can basically tell. So again, a queue is not a mandatory thing. So you can have zero queues or you can have one queue or two queues. Like in this case, like I have provided multiple things that I have asked for. So you can just say like, okay, if you want, you can provide more or less multiple cues to direct the model to exactly give an output in the format you are expecting. So that's a good example around how you can use queues. So here it is not in the main target. So the main target in our example was to write a launch email, but it didn't specifically say like, okay, I want a subject line, I want a body, I want a signature. If you want to add those additional items, then you can add queues along with that so that the model is really clear on what is the output it has to deliver. The next thing is supporting content. So this is the next interesting component. So you may be wondering what is supporting content and why should I really use that? Because primary content we saw, like you use that in conjunction with the model. For instance, if I want to summarize something or if I say translate this text, the text that needs to be translated is primary content. Where does supporting content come into play? So again, let us look at that with an example. So when it comes to the supporting content, sometimes like you have to provide some additional information in terms of like telling the model what you are looking for. So for instance, like you can provide a workshop. So here I'm going to give a title description and I'm going to say planning workshop kickoff. So please join us to kick off our workshop. And then now I'm adding some additional stuff in here. Okay, let me take this again. That is basically typing it, but I haven't put any supporting content yet here. So I'll clear the chat. Cool. So what I'm going to put is in my workshop, I'm going to add some important topics. So this is all the part of the prompt. Okay, that is the important thing to understand. So I'm going to talk about, I want topics around prompt engineering, search, GPT models, and then I'm also going to instruct saying summarize the workshops above grouped by my important topics. So if you look at here, this is the actual prompt. We are talking here about, I'm going to organize a workshop and I gave a title for the workshop and some items related to the workshop. And I'm going to say like, okay, the important topics here, right? This is the supporting content. So I can just, without the supporting content, I can just say like, okay, give me the output. And it is going to give me the list of the tasks for my workshop, but it is not going to group it under the different topics. So if I want to group it under the different topics, then I have to provide some supporting content. And that's what this is all about. So if you now run this, because I'm not describing a lot, but if you can see here, now it is providing the workshop topics in the different categories that I have specified, like the topics on prompt engineering, on search, as well as in on GPT models. So supporting content is not the main target of the task. It can be used in conjunction with your primary content so that it can influence the output in some way. So that is the important aspect to do that. So you may have a primary content, but if you want to group certain things in certain ways, or if you want to add some additional information that you would like to see in the output, then probably you can provide some supporting content that will influence the way how the output will be provided. So as you can see, like we talked about different components associated with the prompt engineering. Instructions, then we looked at the primary content, then you have got examples that we used, then we saw the cues, and then we saw the supporting content. So each one of them, so instruction is mandatory because you have to ask a question, right? But the rest you can use depending on assessing what is the type of question that you are asking. So now we saw the different prompt engineering techniques. What we are going to look at is what are the key best practices that you have to follow when it comes to writing good prompts. So the key best practices are, first thing is be specific. So always be specific around the question that you are asking. So as I gave an example, right? When I say write a program to create a user in Azure Active Directory, and if I want that in C Sharp, I have to be more specific in my prompt asking to write a C Sharp program. So if you don't say that, then it is going to be, it's not specific basically. Be descriptive. So always use analogies wherever possible. double down, which means sometimes it is okay to repeat yourself to the model. So for instance, I told you I gave a text and I said translate to French, right? So what I can do is I can write first instruction to say translate the text below to French and then give the actual primary content, which is the text that needs to be translated. Following that, I can also say translate the above text to French. So you may be wondering, why are you saying the same thing twice? Sometimes if you repeat yourself to the model, like giving the instructions before and after the primary content, it's okay because the model will be much more clear exactly what you are asking for. Order matters. Suppose if I say like, okay, summarize the below text, and if I give the text above, the model will get confused. So if I say summarize the below text, then always give the primary content below that. If I say summarize the above text, then always give the primary content above that. So keep in mind the order really matters. And always give the model an out, which is nothing but give an alternate path. If the model doesn't know how to answer a particular question, you can tell the model in the prompt itself. If you don't know how to answer, then respond with not found or I don't know, I don't have an answer, because this is going to help the model avoiding to generate false responses. So these are some of the best practices that you can follow in order to write good prompts. So as I said, prompt engineering. So there is a prompt engineering guide that you can use, and there is a lot of best practices and techniques that you can learn as part of the prompt engineering guide. So things like starting with clear instructions, focus on the output that you are looking for, which is basically the priming the output, adding clear syntax, prompt chaining, few shot learning, few shot reasoning, break the task down, writing meta prompts. We'll talk about meta prompts shortly, chain of thought prompting, fine tuning, prompt chunking, and also like specifying an output structure, adjusting temperature and top underscore p parameters. Again, we'll look at what those parameters are. When we talk about writing good quality prompts, you should be following these things as best practices. Space efficiency is another aspect that you have to consider when you are writing prompts. So you may be wondering why I should be considering about space efficiency. So normally when you write prompts, large language models, like what it will do is it will chunk that your the GPT models, they chunk that particular words into what we call it as tokens. So the tokens are mainly used especially in the pay as you go model to decide upon like okay, how you can chunk them and get the and also use it from a billing perspective. And then what you have got is you can have as many as tokens initially, like in the earlier GPT-3 models, you can go write prompts with where the tokens can go up to 2000, but now it can go up to 32,000 because the way the new GPT-4 models have come into play. But you need to be really careful around how you use spaces in when you're writing prompts. If you look at this example that you are seeing on screen, so where the colored attribute shows like how a sentence in a sentence the tokens will be created. So normally what happens is it is going to break that words into chunks, and what we call those chunk as tokens. And when you are keep doing that, keep in mind, suppose if you have instead of keeping one space, if you are leaving two spaces, so consecutive white spaces, they will be treated as two different tokens. And that is an easy way to waste the space, because I told you like you have limitations on how many number of tokens that you can use in a prompt. So unnecessarily don't waste your tokens by giving consecutive spaces. So if one space is enough, just leave that. Don't use two spaces or three spaces there, because every space will be considered as a token. The next thing is like wherever possible, use tabular data, because the GPT-4 models, they can understand the tabular formatted data quite easily. In that way, you can it is a space efficient way to include data rather than preceding every field with the name. So like in JSON where you say key and value pairs, right? So you can avoid that. If you have a table, then the header will be once and then the values will be repeated multiple times rather than repeating the header itself. So these are some of the techniques that you can follow in order to save the space within when you're writing prompts. And also like if you don't, for instance, some people have this habit of if you use punctuations like a comma, they leave a space after that. So you don't need both. So the prompt doesn't need to be grammatically looking at like, oh, I need to use commas here and the different punctuations correctly. So if a space is sufficient enough, no need for a comma. And so that is something to keep in mind. So if you want to separate the sentences by just a space that is sufficient, do that. If you put a comma and a space, it will be considered as two tokens. So apply these techniques also, or keep in mind when you are writing prompts.